Yeah, I don't think it will continue, but it will change its nature. It will change its characteristics as it starts to meet some of the environmental challenges.
And I'd just add to that, there's a big difference between relying on the economy and or relying on the markets to meet a whole bunch of our needs, and placing those needs at the centre of both our personal being and our society. Stuff is really handy. You know, I'm not anti-consumption, I'm not anti-capitalism, I'm not anti, you know, a lot of what's called progress. And anyone that thinks there used to be this great era and isn't it terrible these days, I've got one word for you: anaesthetic. All right, you know, dental pain dominated human history. Right? People used to have teeth that rotted in their heads and that would die in pain because they didn't have some of the simple things we take for granted. So what I'm saying is, you know, there's no doubt that we've experienced progress in a way that we can't even imagine. The issue is what we do with that. And I think what your question's getting at is, you know, how long has money been at the centre of our sort of society and at the centre of our being? I think that's quite a recent phenomenon. Because those cultural cues that I started off by talking about, one of the very important cultural cues in all Western 20th century history, first half of the century, you didn't talk about money that much. You know, you didn't talk about how much your house cost. You didn't talk about how much you'd spent on things. You know, that basically the material aspect of people's lives used to be quite petition. And the idea of conspicuous consumption was literally seen as gauche, rude, you know, horrible. You didn't do it. You mocked people who did. And I think that started to change probably from the 1960s. Will it continue forever? Who knows? I hope not. But the idea that we obsess about wealth and we obsess about displaying wealth is, I think, a relatively recent phenomena, and it's only happened because we've let it. There are social laws for chopping people down, and we don't do it anymore.
Question just...
At the start, you put up your hand to say that you don't think economics can save the world. It seems to me that through all the research that economists do and the whole cost-benefit analysis, that economists have a lot of power to influence policy making and decisions. So how can it not save the world is basically my question.
I think my response to that when I initially said that was that, and this is what both Sonia and Richard have been talking about, really the key to saving the world is our cultural values and our attitudes towards things like consumption and the environment, and some of the issues that I talked about was about voluntary restraining consumption for the greater good. And those things to me are about values. Economics is really just a tool to help us understand the way we behave when we make decisions about resources. So it's just one way of thinking about that. It can be a very useful way, but it's not necessarily listened to a lot. Contrary to popular belief, unfortunately, environmental economics is not very influential in policy making. And maybe Richard wants to say something about that.
Yeah, look, I've spent a lot of time working between universities and in politics, and you know, people talk to economists last. Right? They talk to economists once they've figured out what the political compromise they want is, and then they use economists to help them construct an inevitability for doing that. And you know, that might sound cynical, so should be. The only time that I think economics leads and dominates, or that form of evidence leads and dominates debates, is about questions that people don't care about. You know, that if there are hard questions that politicians are disinterested in the answer, then yeah, why not let someone do a study and tell me what the answer is? But anyone that thinks that Kevin Rudd sits in his office waiting to hear from an economist about what he should do, and or that John Howard did similarly, you know, you're mad. It just doesn't work that way. Doesn't mean that economists aren't invited into some conversations. Doesn't mean that they don't give advice about what might be more or less doable. But in terms of setting priorities, in terms of setting overall policy directions, I assure you that no economists were driving industrial relations reform of the Howard era. I assure you no economists were consulted about the war in Iraq. I assure you that no economists were seriously consulted about John Howard's opposition to doing anything about climate change. They just weren't even in the room. Doesn't mean mean they couldn't help if they were there. But, you know, as I said, economics is a very good way of winning the public debate. But there's still politics sitting underneath.
Another question.
What's the current state of Pacific fisheries?
I look at one particular fishery, there's lots of them, but I look at the tuna fisheries, the big commercial tuna fisheries, which essentially spans across the western central area of the region, and tuna move in and out of high seas areas and national zones of about 23, 24 countries, I can't remember. Mixed. There's four commercial species that I studied. One's okay, it'll be okay for the moment, one's marginal and one's going downhill fairly rapidly. And the reason for that is just some of the very reasons that we show in the little game that we play, is that getting cooperation, everyone's up for themselves, everyone wants to put their full up all the time, and they're not willing to put in voluntary restraints. And the reason why, I think these are the questions that I put up, but these are the reasons why I put up those questions, is that A, they rely on the resource for different reasons, different competing reasons. Somebody wants to fish one species, but by doing that they're affecting stocks of others, but they're not interested in that other stock. And the other one is that some are rich and some are poor, and the poor countries aren't willing to compromise. I hope that answers your question.
Question.
Yeah, I have thought economics does influence and even drive social values like consumerism, accumulation of material wealth and stuff. But my question, I guess, was to Richard. Won't your fellow economists beat you to death for suggesting that economic growth is bad and should stop?
Some of them would. Some of them want to beat me to death for a range of other reasons. Look, I'll answer the second part of your question in the context of the first. I think that economics has done a very, very, very powerful job of shaping social norms.
Yes.
But don't confuse that with there were a bunch of economists saying, let's change social norms, here's a way to do it. You know, I'm putting economists in the accountant category, the people you go see because you have to, not the leader category of, you know, let's consult with them about what we should do. I have an accountant. Why do I have an accountant? Because my forms are hard to fill out. So he helps me do it. It's very useful. But he doesn't tell me what to do. He helps me do what I want to do. So that's the kind of distinction I guess I'm trying to make. Yeah, look, economists take for granted, well, they literally assume that economic growth is the be-all and end-all.
Yes.
Oh no, it's expensive. Like, just open up the first chapter of any introductory economics textbook. You can buy one for $5 second hand or flick through one in the library, and it lists all the dumb assumptions that get in the way of good policy. One of them, and it's all usually done in Latin so that people don't quite catch on, or it's done in, you know, sort of obtuse language. So one of the assumptions that you'd miss, except that I've now pointed it out to you, is the importance of non-satiety. Economists assume that individuals' consumption desires are susceptible to non-satiety. That is, they can never be satisfied. Right? We take it as an article of faith, it is an axiom within the logic of the economic system that more is always better than less. So once you've assumed that more is better than less, guess what? When someone concludes that more is better than less, that's called a tautology, that's called a circular argument, it's called nonsense, or in economics, it's called a political imperative for economic growth. Right? It's just an assumption. And, you know, there's a whole bunch of physiological data that says satiety is, that it does exist. And, you know, obese kids are a nice case in point there. But also collectively, satiety, people tire of stuff. That's why they shop so much, because they bought so much already that they're bored. They just replace it with others. So, yeah, economic growth, it's not a conclusion that economic growth brings happiness. It's an assumption, and one that I think is increasingly widely sort of questioned.
And we will have Clive Hamilton in a panel later on in this course, actually looking at the concept of happiness and economic growth, and what Richard here was called affluenza. Okay, and yes, question in the red, and then